Hello, Products of Design. Very nice to see you all. Yes, it's really lovely to be back. You're in, the most special program in the entire universe. It's always an honor to be a part of this program. And as Elspeth indicated, I have spoken several times, and I'll talk about that a bit in a second. And I've slightly changed what I'm going to talk about. And this is all the excuses up front. I just want to say, I tend to be wordy. I tend to be more on the academic side of design. So there's always like not sufficient pictures of cool designs to back up what I'm saying, which means a lot of what I'm saying is a kind of series of questions that I'm working through right at the moment. This is going to talk about some work I'm doing right at the moment. And I'd be really keen to hear what your kind of responses to it are. Okay, so as I said, I've slightly shifted what I said I was going to talk about. And I've got this odd title now, Designing with Those Who Will Have Been Designed By. The bit in the middle is a kind of reference to Ursula Le Guin's famous short story, Those Who Walked Away from the Amelias. I don't know if you know that story at all, but I'll reference a little bit of Ursula Le Guin. But there's a quite deliberate attempt here to kind of say that if design is about transitions, if design is about vision-led transitions, it leads to a bit of a problem when you try to do design research. And so, as Elspeth indicated, I've been quite critical of speculative design, and I'm now trying to work out different ways of using speculative design so that it can begin to enable the kinds of transitions we need. So none of this will make sense until I start talking a little bit. So as indicated, the context for this talk is vision-led transition designing. I'm not going to talk specifically about transition design. I hope you do explore it. You might see that Terry Irwin, who I was working with at Carnegie Mellon University, is being awarded the AIGA medal this year for her work on transition design and a lot of leadership in the whole of the design community for a long time. So I had this great privilege of working with her and her partner Gideon Kossoff on transition design. That's the context. It's not specifically what I'm going to talk about. What I really want to start talking to you about is how many of you actually think of yourself as fantasists. I don't know how many of you fantasize, and I'm obviously not meaning this in any lewd sense. I mean, I wonder how many of you sort of find yourselves daydreaming about alternative ways in which society could be organized. Because it's certainly my opinion that if you're not doing that, you're not a designer. But the job of a designer is to be constantly thinking about these alternative futures and sketching these alternative futures and world building and telling stories that this should be something you were doing all the time. I don't do it so much. I'm constantly mired in the hideousness that is the present, and obviously still, I'm working from home in lockdown in Sydney, where vaccination is a bit slow rolling out in Australia. You're all finally back there masked up. There's a lot of things to hold you in the present. And for a long time, I've sort of been wondering whether designers still feel courageous enough to fantasize. So just thinking generally, trying to get you into this kind of headspace. I know that it's been an important time in New York City in particular, around this time of year, 20 years ago. So let's just take that as a marker, 2001. I'm presuming all of you existed by then. Often when I talk to undergrads, that's not the case. Did you all exist in 2001? I need nods or waves or cheers, like, yes, I existed, or no, I did not exist yet. It was a bit sad. Okay. And we've been reminded, I think, a little traumatically about what time was like then. The absence of mobile phones as people tried to make calls about what was happening in New York at the time. We've got a sense of how much things have shifted. If you just advance 10 years to 2011, I was in New York City. I was teaching at Parsons down the road. I was occasionally at events with Alan. you know, I sort of had a mobile phone. I think I joined Twitter this year, 2011. So a lot happened between 2001 and 2011. And now we're in 2021. I had not anticipated a global pandemic. I arrived in New York City during the global financial crisis. I'm just trying to get you in a mood of thinking about time. And then I'm wondering about 2031. So I'm just trying to give you 10-year jumps. And now you're thinking about 10 years time. You've graduated from one of the best programs in the world. So you're a really significant lead somewhere by this time. You're responsible for actually leading projects, if not leading firms or whole innovation units or some kind of team. I mean, you're successful in 10 years time, and you have the capacity to make a difference to the way the rest of the century plays out through what you design, what you materialize. So I wonder if you fantasize, do you fantasize about what your life is going to be like? And like, if you could wave vaguely at me, like, I do have a picture, for example, of the kind of house that I want to live in 10 years time. Has anyone ever sketched their fantasy house? Some. You should just think at the moment right now what your fantasy house is. Whenever I do this with any design students, it tends to be mid-century modernism. It tends to be glass walls, flat roofs, in the middle of a forest, but for some reason the front door backs onto a very lively city where you can go and see some great shows. So it's this perfect combination of peace in the backyard and vibrant city. And it's always just straight lines, sort of fairly bog standard minimalism. So I don't know if you have a sense of what that looks like. I don't know if it's a house, if it's an apartment. And if you imagine where you want to live, how many countries you're actually enamored with, how many countries you feel an obligation to go back to, whether you'll be there. And I wonder what you think your job is, or maybe it's not a job. Do you really want to be employed by somebody else? Or what are the projects that you're doing? Do you fantasize about this? Is anyone one of those people who has a really concerted plan? You've got a business model, canvas, and you've got a very clear sense of who you want to be in 5 years' time. When you take an interview and they ask you that question, you never even hesitate. You know all the resources that you're amassing to help you get there. If people send the business model canvas. So is anybody like that? Is anybody a very clear vision-led person with plans, to-do lists? No, I'm just looking at you in a small square. None of you are prepared to admit that you're like that. So is this slightly problematic? Is this problematic to be a designer and not have your own strong sense of what you want your life to be like in 10 years' time? And not just kind of mildly yeah, these versions of the current would be good, but actually no, I am an agent of change. And in this case, it's only about you. I wonder if you are also contemplating what it is that you would like the world to be like. And if you could give it a rich picture description, not just a generic one, like I'm at a beauty contest and I'm saying I want world peace. I don't know if you can put specifications around the types of economies, how local, how global, how cosmopolitan, how diverse, how non-diverse. Are people busy? Are they working 7 days a week? Are they working 3 days a week? How are they moving around? Do you think about these things? It's very hard to do this interactive session in this particular mode right now, but I'm very intrigued. And then what would be the tool or canvas that you would possibly use to work out what it is that you should be doing right now to help the world as a designer get to that in 2031? So it's just a way of beginning to help you think about kind of visions and what visions are, because I want to talk to you a little bit about that. And by the way, if you're imagining 10 years time, you certainly need to think about this XKCD cartoon. You need to be thinking, he's younger than I am, so my graph looks slightly longer this in terms of, so I don't know if your fantasy house, mid-century modernist flat-roofed curtain wall, glass curtain wall building in a beautiful forest is taking into account forest fires, is taking into account extreme weather events, putting big wind shear on the roof. if it's really hot, so that you can't actually cycle, it's so hot at certain days. Bloomberg just released a study recently indicating that a lot of the neighbourhoods in Western Sydney, where I live, are about to become uninhabitable. The temperature is getting above 100 Fahrenheit, 40 degrees centigrade. It was like 10 days a year, now it's 15 days a year. It's likely to be 20, 25 days a year. On those days, it does not get below 30 degrees centigrade at night. So you have cooling issues, you have sleeping issues, you have rises in domestic violence. And literally, as you've all seen over this last summer, you have infrastructure beginning to collapse. So I'm not sure if when you were thinking about what the world was going to look like, you'd managed to deal with that. So I'm just trying to get you in the sense of what it means to be a designer and thinking about futures and visions, and what it means to take responsibility as a designer, as a graduate of one of the best programs around, who's going to be incredibly influential, what it means to begin to kind of actually activate your fantasies in those directions. So these have been the general themes of a bunch of talks that I've had the great privilege of talking at SVA. So I think I was trying to work it out last night. I think I've been talking for 8 years. I think I've missed 2 years. I missed one because of a snowstorm when I was just on the way out of the US. And then I think we missed last year. I don't know if Alan can remember this is right, but these are the kind of 5 talks I've given before. And I'm going to run through them because in an odd way, I am actually sort of building on a narrative. It's not always apparent, I think, because those of you who are here now didn't see those earlier ones. So I'll try and explain them a little bit. When I first came to Products of Design, I was using this phrase Maya. I don't know how many people are aware of the phrase Maya. Raise your hand if you've heard Maya, M-A-Y-A. It's also now a design firm in Pittsburgh. So Maya is Raymond Loewy's slogan for more advanced yet acceptable, most advanced yet acceptable. And it was his argument that designers should spend a lot of time doing spec designs. They should deliberately create most advanced designs. They should create excessive visions, precisely because they will stretch what the client thinks is acceptable. If you just give the client what's acceptable, everything stays not progressing. If you put the vision out here, then they will be pulled to think something in the middle is more acceptable. And I use that, you know, we need more advanced and less yet acceptable, because it seemed to me at the time that a lot of what was happening back then, which had to do with the arrival of lean UX, lean startup, lean agile, that at that point, everybody was so focused on microevolution of the acceptable that we kind of lost the capacity to vision. And interestingly, I did this work prior to beginning to think about transition design with Terry and Gideon. So in this sense, design's job is to expand possibilities. But when I came back the next year, I realized that that needed to be nuanced, because there were people who have strong, bold visions of the future that are really out there. And unfortunately, they tend to be tech bros. And they tend to be tech bros who think that it's possible to solve the whole of politics just with an app and some machine learning. And they had the power to say, we should throw caution to the wind and we should just pursue these visions, because the crises are so enormous that we need to do anything. We need moonshots. So you should let me have lots of money so that I can go to Mars. So I was very worried about that. And I sort of tried to temper the idea of vision-led designing by saying, well, nevertheless, the job of designers is also to be precautious. The whole point of a studio, of doing studio work, is that you are able to test ideas without actually having to field test them. Agile, lean is all about putting it in the field, the minimum viable product, which is very dangerous. It's out there already. The whole special place of the studio allows decisions to be made in protected spaces. So I was trying to say, we need vision, but we need to be precautious. I came back the year after that, kind of saying, you know, being visionary is also not just saying yes. At that point, design thinking was again resurgent, and this kind of idea that it's the job of the designer to be like a theatre improviser and always say yes and. You're never allowed to refuse any proposition, because it's all about creative ideation. You're in a brainstorming session, somebody says something, you must only ever use the phrase yes and. And I sat there thinking, in fact, to my mind, what designers do best is say, no, but maybe this. That designers are critics, that designers are people who don't accept the brief as the client says it, but rework the brief, understand the problem differently, see new solution fields than the client asked for. Don't just simply do whatever feature it is that the market is asking for. That designers are decision makers. I have a colleague, Sama Akash, who used to run the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Architecture, who has written a couple of times about the fact that the Arabic word for design is closer to decision maker than form giver. That you go to a designer to make a decision for you. They're the ones who can say no. And the year after that, I said, one of the big obstacles for this kind of saying no is an excessive reliance on empathy. That the kind of design thinking push that research is about empathizing. I thought this is dangerous. This is dangerous because it means that we do get mired in the present. We empathize with people's current problems. If you think about a term taken from Anne-Marie Moll's work, the logic of care, the job of an expert is not necessarily to respond directly to somebody's pain, but rather to step back and risk not responding in order to come up with a more systemic solution. That the logic of care is sometimes the cautious decision to require people to do what they do not want. Obviously, huge responsibilities and political, ethical questions associated with this. So in each of these cases, I was sort of trying to build a sense of what vision-led designing should be. It should be cautious, it should avoid yes and, it should not necessarily be so empathetic. And I think this was a distance lecture 2 years ago, just at the start of COVID. And this was an attempt to kind of say, when you do say no, it sounds like a sacrifice. It sounds like you're asking people to actually suffer, which is kind of what was implied, certainly by this image from the Marathon Man film. But I tried to suggest that one of the interesting things about transition, when you move from one world to another world via transition, what looks like pain and suffering here isn't necessarily pain and suffering there. What looks like what you value now is not what you will value in the future. So saying no in order to enact a vision isn't necessarily asking people to sacrifice something. And it's on this particular issue that I'd sort of like to follow up this year a little bit. As I said, I'm speaking from the context of transition design. I'm speaking from the idea that what we now need are systems level transitions from the current system, way of organizing society and resourcing our everyday lives, to a very different way of proceeding. We need systems level change. We now know we're not just in a pandemic, we're in syndemics, colliding pandemics, climate change, various kind of health conditions, ongoing inequity, the persistence of racism and xenophobia. These are colliding situations. You cannot respond to one. We need a large scale shift. We need to transition. But when you transition from system A to system B, it's not just that you will stay the same and the world will change. You will be different because you're in a different world. And or the world will be different because you will have changed. Now, it's very difficult to think about this. And again, I'll just get you to pause and think. I don't know if you, I certainly don't want you to confess this now, but I wonder if you just think in your mind about any personality shifts, maturing, development, changes you've consciously or unconsciously made from 5 years ago. Are you the same person you were 5 years ago? Some of you are perhaps living in New York City for the first time, and you've come from other places in the world. And when you go back home, people will notice that you've changed because you're now living in New York City, and you're now interacting with a whole bunch of different people, and you're looking at discourses and practices. The program itself will have modified your body and your mind. All these things will have, effectively changed. You will be different. I don't know if you can remember how different. You normally can't, because the whole point is we keep the point about being a subject is you think you stay the same. But you have changed, your values have changed, your desires have changed, you're not the same. So a transition is a change of everything in that way. And this starts to make a real problem. I tried to say in the sacrifice lecture, it's good, it's positive, because it means when you ask somebody to do something that's difficult or effortful now, in this situation, it won't be. If you think about just training to do exercise, it's obviously difficult on this side and painful, but once you become a fit person, the same exercise is not difficult or painful, might even give you pleasure, might even cause a rush of endorphins as you do it. So these things shift and change. And that makes it very difficult to be a designer and to do design research, because it means that I want to try and get everybody to system B. And so I have to work out how to transition them, but I have to research in system A. So how do I talk to people? How do I understand people? Not as they are, but as they might be. As I've indicated in the title, as they will have been. An odd English future perfect tense. What would they do? What might they do? What will they have been? So how do you do this kind of research? Now, this is all very abstract. So let me give you a specific example that I've been working on at the moment. So as part of the university, we run a kind of applied design research centre, as Elspeth indicated. And we've been doing a lot of work at the moment in Australia in relation to renewable energy. So Australia has one of the highest per capita solar rooftop installation in the world. About 30% of houses in Australia have rooftop solar. That's not everywhere, but in some places, South Australia, Queensland, it's up around 50%. And so in other places, on average, 30% of households, 1 in 3 households, now have rooftop solar on. That has happened, by the way, under 10 years of conservative climate denying government who only ever back mining, the coal industry, the steel industry, the gas industry. So despite people voting for conservatives who are climate denying, Australia has one of the highest penetrations of rooftop solar. And we've started experiencing the transition. Other places in the world have experienced the transition as well, California, for instance, but we have experienced this transition. Now, on the one hand, this just looks like a transition from a fossil fuel-based coal-fired power stations to renewables. It just looks like it's a background shift in source. In fact, many more things are changing. So it is a shift from really large-scale utilities, used to be government-owned, corporatized, privatized, very large, huge capital investment, things like coal-fired power stations or even more enormously nuclear. We don't have nuclear, but you do in the US. So huge centralized, to energy being produced by every household everywhere. In Australia, the largest producer of electricity is rooftops. It's bigger than any other entity. Now, it's obviously not an entity, it's distributed, it's all over the place. They don't work as a virtual power plant. They're just all over the place and quite chaotic. This means that we're moving from an electricity grid that was one way to one that is two way. What that means is that it used to be that someone produces power somewhere, it comes to my house and I use it. I am a consumer of the power, they are the producer. Now I am a prosumer, I don't like the word, but it's a mashup of a consumer who also produces. Not just that, if I'm on a household here, not my house, not this house I'm in at the moment, where we just have extraordinarily low energy bills because we have almost no, active heating or cooling because of the design of the house. So we don't need solar so much, but in houses around here, my neighbor just across the road, he's not just a producer of electricity, he's a storer of electricity. And very soon he's going to be a distributor of electricity. So this is a major transition. It's not just a background, switch out one fuel source and stick in another, everything else stays the same. This is an everything change transition. And households themselves are changing. The actual meaning of what it means to be a household are changing. So in this kind of inner city suburb I'm in, where people have solar access, generally freestanding, sometimes just two houses put together, not high density, but in this particular area, all these people used to hate electricity, never want to think about it. It's just a bill. People don't think about electricity, they think about the use of electricity. So they have a set and forget mindset, and they were encouraged for 100 years to have a set and forget mindset. Just set up a contract with a utility and don't worry, we'll keep the power on. You just use it whenever you want. Don't even think about it. We don't want you to think about it. If you think about it, you're going to start to mess with a whole bunch of voltage that might kill you. So for 100 years, we get told, just set and forget. All of a sudden now, the situation becomes a lot more adaptive and flexible, different types of scheduling. You need to understand something. If I've got rooftop solar, I need to understand something about what's happening in the energy in my house. I have a battery. My whole house now looks like my laptop, where I'm constantly looking at the battery in the top corner, wondering how much power have I got left? How long have I got? Can I run the washing machine? Can I do some pre-cooling? Maybe I could heat some water now because the sun is high. And as a result, I don't even do this individually because even though it's distributed, it doesn't really work at a household level. It's difficult to get the roof area and the battery size to cover a house. So it has to be a microgrid. It might be completely a grid of grids, but I have to stop thinking as an individual consumer and have to start thinking about as a community batteries. And then most interesting, which I want to talk to you about in this transition, the whole of the first 100 years of electricity was mostly about a scarce resource. When they first brought nuclear, they were saying it was going to be too cheap to meter and you could just use as much as you like, but that never happened. So mostly people's mindset, mental model for electricity is, it's scarce, I need to be careful about using it, but I can't be because I'm addicted to all these devices and habits and household practices. So then I get bill shock. The end of the month or the end of the quarter, the utility sends me a bill and I'm like, how did I use so much power? We are now in situations of temporary abundance with respect to energy. So I'll just talk about this in particular because it's a kind of interesting problem. This is the problem that occurred in California, and it's now occurring much more frequently in Australia. California didn't quite know what to do with it, and now Australia has actually made what's called a rule change in the electricity grid to deal with it. So I don't want to go into too much detail here, but this is the famous duck demand curve. Operational demand means the gap between how much energy is being produced and how much people want. So when it's right up the top, it means that people want lots of electricity and it's hitting out the very capacity that can be produced. So that leads to blackouts in a summer because everybody's turning on their air conditioning. It's a hot evening, people come home from work and they all turn on really inefficient window box air conditioners in every appallingly designed New York apartment. And that causes a huge draw on the power, and the power stations can't provide enough power. So then they have to start blacking out places because in fact the system, though we were told it's one way, is balanced. But then you get the reverse problem. The reverse problem is now happening, as you can see, 12, 1, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, mostly spring and autumn when people aren't running air conditioners, electric air conditioners. And so there is tons of solar in the system, rooftops everywhere, unregulated, distributed rooftops are producing too much power, more power than the grid can handle. Nobody wants the power at 2 and 3 and 4 in the afternoon. They're happy to sit outside with a cup of tea or coffee, doing some work on a laptop while they work from home. They're not running air conditioners or lights. They haven't got anything going, no household activities, at the exact same time that there's the most amount of power being produced. Now, the industry call this the minimum demand problem, meaning it's the problem with consumers. They're not demanding enough at the right time. How do we make them demand more electricity when it's available? Because electricity is hard to store. It's a moving energy source. So the answer to the minimum demand problem in Australia is negative prices. Sorry, I know this is getting a bit technical for you halfway through the moment of lapsed concentration in a Zoom lecture. But I don't know if anyone's had any experience of a negative price. Does anyone have a good mental model of a negative price? No one's, I suppose you wouldn't be in a data, it would only be in electricity. I'm trying to think of something else where you might experience a negative price. So a negative price means the operator, the market operator, is going to charge you money if you export electricity to the grid. And they're going to pay people to use electricity. So if you run your electric hot water heater at 2 p.m, they will pay you to do that, because what you will be doing is continuing to pull power when it's being produced. If you get minimum demand, the whole grid becomes unstable because electricity has to flow. And if it doesn't flow, it begins to flow back. Devices begin to start going backwards. The very devices you control the whole grid with don't work because they rely on a flow through them to work. We use electricity to control electricity. So if the electricity is low because it's not going anywhere, the whole thing collapses. It's not just a phased blackout with peak demand. It's a sloshing, failing electricity grid. So that's a kind of technical issue. The takeaway from this is the problem of abundance. There is more electricity than we need in Australia at the moment in some states in a spring and autumn afternoon, spring and fall afternoon. And it's going to completely destroy the grid. The grid doesn't work. The 20th century one-way centralized system, we now need a completely different mental model, everyday habits. Households need to think differently. Households need to think about electricity for the first time, and they need to think differently about electricity. And then they need to think about themselves not as consumers, but as prosumers. This is a transition. It's not necessarily a transition to more equitable and sustainable futures, though it can be less climate change inducing, but it's a transition. Here's a quick example of it. Now, these come from, as you can see, Portland General Electric. I stole these very ugly slides just to kind of make this point. I'll try and make it quickly. They talk about the way in which for the first 100 years of electrification, appliances have only ever done the kind of dumb devices. You just plug them in and then the consumer can turn them on anytime they like. The consumer just demands. They say that you could call this an egonetic device. What we now need are allonetic devices, which is the ability of an electric device to beneficially support the operation of the grid, meaning the device's job is not just to do something for the consumer, to turn on and wash the dishes or to turn on and connect to the internet. It's now got a two-way job. Half its job is to do something for the consumer, the household, you, when you ask it, turn it on. The other half is to then have a look at the state of the grid and think, well, should we turn on now? And if the answer is no, because there's not enough power or there's too much power, then turning back to the consumer and negotiating. This is a device that is now negotiating with you about when is the best time to use this device. This is a completely different interaction design paradigm for product design. These are products that now need to negotiate their use. There's lots of ways to solve this. You could kind of hope to do it with a smart algorithm, but you could also just simply do it with a very simple conversational user interface. I see that you want to wash the dishes now. Look, it'd be better if you wash the dishes in 2 hours' time. There's going to be a negative price. You could make some money by washing your dishes in 2 hours' time. Do you need it now? I can run it now. It's okay. We can do that. Do you want to do that? Now, if I run through that conversation with you, that conversational user interface, that sounds like a nightmare. That sounds like a nightmare in this paradigm. In this paradigm where the consumer is sovereign and can just turn on anything, anytime, even if it causes climate change, and even if it gives them massive electricity bills. We do negotiate a lot with a lot of things, and that's also hell. We spend a lot of time negotiating with the healthcare system. All of a sudden, I'm sick and I just want some healthcare, and then I have to call up my insurer. Which doctor can I see? Well, can I see this one? Is it possible for you to allow me to see this one, but then get this? And then if they recommend these meds, we do that negotiation already. And it's awful. It's badly designed. We need to be service designing it, if not completely transitioning out of privatized healthcare to some kind of socialized healthcare. So we are in the middle of a transition from sovereign consumer goods to negotiated goods. And this is a design challenge. Or to put it another way, the transition from centralized to distributed, from one-way to two-way, from consumer to producer-consumer, from individual to community, that transition, how that transition happens, is utterly dependent upon interaction designers for how those new ways of being are created. So I've just used this example here of a kind of electricity monitor sitting in a kitchen. But I actually think this is exactly not what the transition wants. This is bad design. Nobody wants to be looking at numbers and figures in their kitchen. I don't know if you want to be sitting in your kitchen looking at numbers and figures of energy use. There would be interaction paradigms. There would be models, mental models for thinking about how to engage with electricity that you're producing, that a community battery is storing. There would be ways of designing this. It's going to completely redesign the kitchen. I mean, if you think about it, the houses we live in now were designed roughly 100 years ago when electrification started. Now that we are moving to distributed systems, this is the first real radical shift in interior design in 100 years. The nature of the household is about to change. And the people who make those decisions are not utilities and engineers and politicians or people doing market design with negative prices. It's designers. It's people who know how to make products of design. But how do I do that design work? According to the industry, so this comes from the West Australian government, I do need to consult consumers, customers, citizens. And so I consult them and I try to explain them this transition. But the way I explain this transition is all speaking from the existing paradigm. As an individual customer, I can. It's all still sovereign language. You can do this, you can do this. Terrible graphics. You can critique the visual communication some other time. And the whole idea of a linear roadmap is also appalling. But the thing I just want to focus on is that as a customer, I can. To do this transition design, I don't research existing customers. I need to research future customers. I need to research what people will have become for these further down the roadmap sections. How do I speak to future people? The industry at the moment is just doing appalling consumer work. They do these kind of segmentations, this quite neo-colonialist segmentation, actually done by my own institution, the University of Technology, Sydney. Other people did this particular kind of study. It's based on a standard. It's not theirs. They just borrowed this. But this type of segmentation, I don't think helps you get at future customers. One of the more interesting ones I've seen was done by an organization called Energy Consumers Australia, working with a kind of consumer insight company. And in this case, they looked at somebody's whole lifespan and they said, okay, well, people have different and changing relationships to electricity throughout their life. When they're at home and studying, when they're married, it was a very sort of cis white model, suburban model that they were taking as their norm. But you know, if I'm at home and then I'm setting up my first house and I've got kids, and now I've got older kids and I'm going to work, and then I'm an empty nester. When I'm an empty nester, I can finally actually think about electricity and changing my electricity behaviors because I have more capacity. I'm not doing the daily grind of just trying to get the kids to school. So this research, which is not just a bad market segmentation, at least recognize that customers themselves change over time. Very standard version of aging over time. But this allowed my organization to then come and say to them, yes, customers change over time. And the same logic you've got here, that me, older, is different from me, younger, that will also be the case with me moving into a house that has rooftop solar and a battery and a capacity to shunt electricity to a community battery, into my battery, into hot water. Great big lever in my house, sending the electricity in different directions. I'm going to be different. So if you ask me in a focus group right now, do I want to be shunting electricity? I say no. But if you showed me a rich picture of what this would look and feel like, then I can begin to answer you from my future self. I can begin to suggest what I would do, might do, using all these subjunctive tenses. So this is then the question, how to research what someone would do if things were different and if they themselves were different. And again, I think the answer has something to do with designers being much more adept at creating visions, not these sorts of a classic kind of photo montage, which try to be attractors of a so-called sustainable future. I think we just need to think about different types of visions. You can have attractors, but I can't really, these just look like me in a pretty chaotic landscape. Chaotic now because it's got a lot of produce and different types of vehicles. But this is attracting me, but I can't really put myself into this picture and imagine what I would do here. It's not designed to help me think about how I would be different. So I might have attractors as visions. I might have dissuaders as visions. This was Stuart Candy's sort of speculative design, which pretends to be a consumer product on the market. It's designed to make people have the reaction of the man on the right and think, oh my goodness, who could possibly want that? These things always backfire, and there's always someone in the audience who then calls up someone like Stuart Candy and says, can I help you produce this? This is a great idea. We should be marketing this as soon as possible. But this is a better version of a vision than this one because it is artifact-based and it has the veracity of something physical. It pretends to be a technology. So I can now put myself in the situation of thinking, would I want to parent this way? Would I want to put my child in this kind of system? I don't think it does enough work to discourage people, but it is an attempt to kind of do a dissuader. I might just be somebody stretching possibilities, which is the kind of most advanced that I was talking about before. And then I might just actually future in order to kind of understand more the current constraints. It's very difficult to recognize what is normal or to actually reframe the current situation. And I'm only just using this as an opportunity to just call out this book. I just read it. So I'm sort of going through the back catalogue of Ursula Le Guin. And this is a basic plea to say every designer should only ever be reading science fiction or fantasy or anything that involves different worlds. I think having a capacity to understand how world building happens and is done well, and then to learn to put yourself in different worlds and try to discern the logic of people in those worlds. This is the skill of a science fiction fantasy writer. This book, which is less well known, of Ursula Le Guin's, it's got a sort of stupid premise, which is while people are delayed with flights at airports, they suddenly discover that they can travel virtually to different planes. So while you're waiting to change planes in O'Hare because of a snowstorm, these people then go to completely different worlds. It's just an excuse for Ursula Le Guin to come up with 20 different worlds, all with various levels of strangeness, and to just give you a quick sample of their logic of what it is to live in that world. The one that really struck with me was this quite beautiful description of a group of people who have bird-like features, and their planet takes a long time to go around the sun, so 1 year is effectively 6 years. And as a result, when it's winter, they all migrate north. They all move north and live an agricultural existence. And then when it's summer, they all move south into a city existence. And so it's this really interesting study of, it's not city or country. You can have both. And she thinks through, and again, with Ursula Le Guin, there's always the sexual politics of it. When people are in the country, it's about reproduction and pleasure. When people are in the city, their sex drive completely disappears, which is a complete reverse of the way we normally think of it. And so in the city, they're quite asexual. And as a result, they do a lot to develop their society and further it. Anyway, just magnificent little thought experiments. So what I'm doing here is just giving you a typology of different types of visions, visions as attractors, visions as dissuaders, visions as possibilizers. And then this kind of visions that allow me to discern my own constraints and reframe them. But the point that I'm trying to get to is we need to begin to work out how to create visions that enable people to ask, would I? Not will I, but would I? And this is a kind of speculative design. It's not Dunn and Raby's type of speculative design that Elspeth indicated I've been quite critical of. It is more like what Stuart Candy calls artifacts from the future. The kind of techniques we've discovered, and I'm now just going to give you some really quick tips on how to do this, that when you're visioning, I don't have any particular genre or kind of examples to show you, so just some quick tips. The point is to do products. Products acts as foregrounds that give plausibility to worlds, transition to systems in the background. So you use the obstacle. It's not quite, Stuart Candy's one, which is all artifact. You can't quite see the world at all. It's rather you use the artifact as the hook, as the MacGuffin, as Dan Hill would say, to draw people in to begin to put themselves in a situation more like this, so that they can begin to imagine how they would operate in that realm. So you have artifacts from the future, you make them to high levels of fidelity in order to put them in the foreground, but the intent is not to get people to think about that. The intent is for them to notice the background. I don't have time to tell you this, but it actually comes from a very beautiful philosophy of literature by Elaine Scarry, where she tries to talk about why does Marcel Proust's buildings feel so solid? And she said it's because in the description, he's always moving shadows or curtains across the front of them. And so if you concentrate on the front, the background feels solid. So if you have this artifact, it gives the world solidity, which allows you to be in the world. And then the whole point is, as I said, you're not testing the artifact. This is not about market testing of a future object. You're testing the world and seeing how people feel in that world. And then you have to use all the tricks of kind of dramaturgy and screenwriting. People need to have other motivations. There's another drama, a story, and they just happen to use this device, which is normalized. You don't explain everything. Like the whole point is to draw participants in, because not everything's explained. So some devices do things and you're like, well, how did that happen? And once someone is doing that, they are in the world and they begin to build its logic. You don't make the world perfect, that's for sure. It's not a utopia. There needs to still be all these other kind of challenges. You use, David Mamet style, always enter the scene late and always leave the scene early. And then you don't just simply put artifact and background, but a kind of nesting. You give people a sense of locations, multiple locations. You have a sense of these nested systems. So these are the really quick principles that we've found, that when you do this world building, it allows the vision, which isn't only visual, it's quite verbal. It gives people a capacity to put themselves in the world and then begin to deliver research back to you about whether they would, in that transition to system, begin to act differently. And so that's how I think you can begin to do these kind of transitions. So right now we're doing this work with some colleagues at the Australian National University. So they've been thinking about algorithms for community batteries. And they've done let's ask people in system A, what do they value? They value saving money and simple and carbon reductions. And they've designed the algorithm for the way the community battery distributes energy. They've come up with different algorithms that don't just strengthen the grid, but actually articulate these customer values. But they're engineers, and so they haven't thought about the interface on these algorithms at all. They haven't thought about the way people will understand, have a mental model of the algorithm in the community battery. And so we are now doing speculative design of these interfaces. Our job is not to come up with the interface that we can then commercialize and sell. Our job is to understand what people are going to be like in an equitable, sustainable, distributed energy system. So we're using visions not as kind of pulls or pushes, but as understanding research mechanisms. And I think this is a very different way of beginning to think about using visioning and designing. It does just mean that all designers need to be constantly visioning, constantly trying out their visioning skills, not solving current problems, not just imagining different artifacts and interactions, but whole world building. It requires a constant skill, a constantly maintained and developed skill in developing multiple genres of world building. Okay, so that was a very complicated long run through a bunch of different things, from visioning through distributed energy up to this weird idea about ways in which we might use speculative design. And hopefully we can get the system working to do some interaction. But thank you